The Stirrup thesis claims that without this little loop of metal, the world of fantasy as we know it simply wouldn't exist. No King Arthur, no Jaime Lannister, no Paladins. Now, I'll admit, the stirrup and the saddle development that accompanied it surely did help the knight. It allowed an armored warrior to deliver a devastating blow with a lance without being catapulted off the back of their own horse. But that wasn't actually what gave rise to the knights. The stirrup might have provided the hardware, but it didn't provide the paycheck. A knight is, effectively, a medieval tank, and tanks are expensive. To build a class of elite, mobile warriors, you need some way to pay them, and that's where an awful lot of complexity entered the political picture of knighthood. Today, in our first video in a series about knights, we're looking at the bloody, bureaucratic, and deeply practical origins of the knight. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Before we get into the shining armor and the codes of honor, we have to talk about the business model behind knights. The truth is, in the early Middle Ages, being a knight was less of a calling and much more of a career path for the heavily armed warrior. To understand where the knight comes from, you have to look at two very different traditions crashing together. On the one hand, you had the Roman equites, essentially a social class of people who were simply rich enough to own a horse and were part of the military of Rome. But then, wasn't everyone? On the other hand, you had the Germanic tradition of the comitatus, a war band of elite warriors bound by their blood oaths to their chieftain. And that takes us back to that very pivotal moment in history, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. After the collapse of Rome, there was much chaos in the land. Maybe. I'm currently reading Goliath's Curse, which is a very interesting take on societal collapse, which I'll make some videos about later. But for now, let's focus on the idea of chaos in the land. Order was slowly restored in a patchwork way by warriors taking control of their local environments. The strongest of these, in the timeline we're picking up, were the Merovingians, the long-haired kings. And I have made a video about them previously because they had the most insane family history you've ever seen. Check it out in the info card for inspirations from history. Anyway, the Merovingians were the successors to Roman Gaul, and they tried to keep the Roman dream alive by relying on taxation to create a standing army, because that's what they wanted, a professional standing army paid in coin, just like the legions. There was, however, a problem with that. Whether there was chaos in the land or not, the Roman administrative machine was surely dead. Infrastructure was crumbling, trade was shrinking, and the bureaucracy required to collect taxes had evaporated. Without tax revenue, the Merovingian kings couldn't pay a standing army, and thus they reverted to that German tradition of comitatus. I'm pretty sure you can see the problem here. Voluntary warriors are famously hard to control, what with all that voluntariness. And by the 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become the do-nothing kings, losing their power to their chief of staff, the mayor of the palace. And that brings us to the rise of the Carolingians, who ushered in the era of the knight. The Frankish kingdom as we know it was seized by a family of those self-same mayors of the palace, and it all started with Charles Martel, also called Charles the Hammer, a man who gets way too little credit in history. After the Battle of Tours in 732, Martel realized that the Frankish infantry, mostly part-time farmers with shields, and the German comitatus tradition just could not effectively counter the highly mobile, fast-striking cavalry threats coming from the Umayyad Caliphate, who had taken Spain at this point. So Charles needed a permanent professional cavalry force, but the Merovingians had proven that there just was not the tax base for this. There was not money in the treasury. And this is where Charles broke from the Merovingian tradition, and he did something pretty radical to pay his cavalry force. He seized church lands. He took vast estates from the church and handed them out to his most loyal warriors. This was the political start of the knighthood. These fiefs were not actually a gift. They were a contract between liege and warrior. The liege promised to give the warrior land, also called the benefice, and the warrior got all the income from that land and the peasants who worked on that land. They could purchase a war horse, expensive armor, weapons, and so on. The knight, that is. The knight could purchase all these things. In return, the warrior promised to ride at the liege's command. Answer the liege's call to banners and all that. Pippin, Charles Martel's son, expanded on this culture and basically cleared away the last of the Merovingians. And Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, was the capstone on the project, as it were. By the time Charlemagne took the throne, this system of proto-feudalism was the backbone of the Frankish Empire. And Charlemagne turned that contract into a formal hierarchy. He needed to govern a territory that stretched from modern-day France to Germany and Italy. And without a centralized bank or a telephone, the only way to hold that territory together was to franchise it out to these armored elites, and that brings us to the pyramid scheme of governance: feudalism. Feudalism created a massive power shift. The knight was no longer just a guy on a horse raiding a village. He was a local landlord with a monopoly on violence. It's here that the stirrup plays its part, though it wasn't the only factor. The development of the high-backed war saddle actually did much of the heavy lifting to keep riders seated during a charge. We'll be diving deep into the hardware of a knight later in this series. Anyway, this Carolingian shift in how we paid for war changed the value of the human being inside the armor. Just think through the implications here. Under the old Merovingian system, if a warrior died, you just found another warm body, slapped a spear onto him, and you were good to go. But under the Carolingian franchise model, the knight represented a massive capital investment. More than a reward, the fief was a production facility for the knight. It took years of surplus grain, wool, and peasant labor to fund a single knight's panoply. If that knight kicked the bucket in a ditch, the king didn't just lose a soldier, he lost the military output of an entire estate. And that is how we got ransom culture. By the High Middle Ages, the battlefield began to look less like a place of slaughter and more like a high-stakes commodities market, at least from a knight's perspective. Let's be real, the peasant levies, they still got slaughtered. If anyone asks me why I don't want to live in the past, that's why. The chances of me being a knight and being, or one of the cool kids on the battlefield that got captured for ransom, vanishingly small. The chance of me being one of the peasants holding a spear I barely know how to use, freaking massive. If you were a knight and you managed to unhorse your opponent, your first thought wasn't, I must get off my mount and slay this enemy. No, no, no. It was, I'm about to buy me a second castle. You would capture your opponent, treat him with a bizarre level of hospitality, essentially putting him up in a 5-star hotel, or the medieval equivalent, which, wasn't really a 5-star hotel, but anyway. And then you would just wait for his family or his tenant peasants or whoever to scrape together enough gold to buy him back from you. Through this asset recovery mechanism, war became a business for the social elite, where the primary concern of knightly courts was often the collection of ransoms rather than the pursuit of any abstract sense of honor. We see the DNA of this, the business of knighthood, all over our fantasy worlds, where it usually serves as the reality check for our protagonists. Take George R.R. Martin's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Well, the adaptation is called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. The original books is Duncan Egge's books, and they're great, and I enjoy the adaptation. Anyway, Sir Duncan the Tall is a hedge knight. He has the gear of a knight and the title, but he has no land. He is essentially a freelance contractor in a world built on franchises. For Dunk, losing a single joust means a complete loss of livelihood, as we see in the early episodes of that show on HBO. The laws of chivalry dictate that the winner claims the loser's horse and armory, and without a fief to pay for replacement, Dunk is one bad day away from being a peasant once more. Or consider Tamora Pierce's Protector of the Small series. While Caladri of Mindolin is driven by a genuine, semi-modern sense of justice and honor, she operates in a system where the old guard of Tortal treats war like a sport for the landed gentry. The knightly thing to do is to capture the noble enemy and treat them well, while the common soldiers, the ones without a fief to their name, are often slaughtered because there's no profit in keeping them alive. Now, before I tell you about the church's response to the seizing of property and the rise of chivalry, give me one moment to tell you about Sangwil Chronicles, which is where I have my own version of knights, though they're not so horse-orientated because of, magic. Sangwil Chronicles is Louis's story, and he is an assassin that one reviewer described as a medieval James Bond. The series is complete at 4 books and is available on my website as an ebook box set with 8 pieces of human-drawn character art included as high-res images. Or you can get the physical copies via Amazon or any other online bookshop. Oh, and on a side note, I won Flash 500's novel opening competition in 2025, so at least you know that I can write reasonably well. Links to all that down below. If you use Knight 2026 on my website, you'll get a 20% discount on all digital books on my website. Okay, enough of that. Let's get back to knights. Now, if you're the church in the 9th and 10th centuries, you have a problem. Charles Martel might have saved Western Christendom at the Battle of Tours, but he did it by effectively mugging the church for their lands. By the time the Carolingian Empire began to fracture, Europe was left with thousands of heavily armed, land-owning, chest-thumping warrior types with a lot of spare time and a literal monopoly on violence. And let me tell you, these early knights, they were no one's idea of a Galahad. They were more like state-sponsored biker gangs. When they weren't fighting for their lords, they were bored, and a bored knight usually meant a burnt village. They were dangerous to the peasantry, dangerous to the merchant, and most importantly to the Pope. They were dangerous to the church's remaining property. But the church at this time didn't have much of a military of its own. So what was the Pope to do? Well, They turned to that old tried and true method of elites everywhere. They brainwashed the knights. By the way, for a more detailed dive into honor codes and their development, check out my videos on that topic linked in the information card. Okay, so in the late 10th century, the church launched a series of movements called the Peace and Truce of God. They gathered the knights together and essentially made them swear on holy relics to stop hitting people who couldn't hit back, namely priests, merchants, and widows. But you can't just tell a warrior class, don't fight. Literally, it's what they're good at, and they need an outlet for those skills. So to be effective at controlling them, you have to give them someone new to fight. This is where we see the birth of sanctified violence. The church took the testosterone culture and pointed it outward. They rebranded the knight from a local enforcer to a soldier of Christ. The sword wasn't a tool for land grabs. No. It was a holy instrument. If you killed the enemies of the faith, you weren't a murderer, you were a candidate for heaven. Now, to make any rebranding stick, you need good stories. This era saw the rise of the chanson de geste, literally songs of heroic deeds. Composed a good century after the real events they're inspired by and performed by travelling jongleurs to the rhythmic strumming of a medieval fiddle, these songs were designed to pump up a crowd of knights before a campaign or entertain them by the fire and set their moral tone. The first that we know of is the Matter of France. These were the legendary tales of Charlemagne and his 12 peers, the Paladins. Side note, this is where we get the term Paladin from, long before the D&D class. Paladin actually means of the palace, and they were basically the final evolution of that Germanic comitatus I mentioned earlier, the elite inner circle bound to their lord by blood and oath. The most famous of these pieces of art in the Matter of France is the Song of Roland. This was apparently the centerpiece of a much larger Charlemagnean cinematic universe. Other songs and stories filled in the gaps in the narrative, giving Roland and his peers backstories and boyhood tales, supplying a legendary sword named Durandal, supposedly containing a tooth from St. Peter, and building soulmate rival stories like Roland's relationship with Oliver. There was even a prequel explaining how Roland was Charlemagne's secret nephew, and a spin-off about his best friend Oliver's sister, Aude. It was an entire shared mythology that created a Charlemagne fan fiction culture. Whether you were a knight in Spain or Poland, you heard about Roland and claimed those chivalric ideals for yourself. You weren't just a mercenary, you were a righteous warrior in the mold of the Paladins, whether or not you had a righteous bone in your body. The actual history those poems were based on is, of course, far messier. The poem depicts Roland's death as a massive holy war against the Saracens, but it's propaganda. In reality, the Battle of Roncesvalles in 778 AD wasn't a clash of civilizations. It was a disastrous tactical blunder. Charlemagne had actually been in Spain to help a Muslim faction in a civil war. When the campaign failed, his army retreated through the Pyrenees Mountains. And as they moved through the narrow pass at Roncesvalles, it wasn't the Saracen army that hit them, it was the local Basque Christians. The Basques were furious because Charlemagne's retreating army had just leveled the walls of their capital, Pamplona. They used the high ground to ambush the rearguard, cutting them off in the forest and slaughtering them, including the real-life historical figure Rolandanus, Roland, the warden of Breton March. Charlemagne didn't stay to avenge them with divine miracles like in the poem. He kept riding for home. But 300 years later, when the Crusades began, that embarrassing mountain ambush was rebranded. The Basques were swapped out for the Saracens, the blunder became martyrdom, and the tactical defeat was transformed into the founding myth of Western chivalry. Look, I'm a cynic. If you're looking for an Arthurian fairy tale, well, I don't know what to tell you. However, what I can say is that the gap between propaganda and reality is where the best stories live. In A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, George R.R. Martin plays with this brilliantly. Duncan the Tall is a true believer. He believes it's a knight's duty to protect the weak. That is what he was taught. But then he encounters the Targaryen princes, men who use their knightly status as a license for cruelty, proving that the shining armor often hides a monster. Dunk finds himself in a world where being a true knight is actually pretty radical, because really it goes against the actual values of his class. And if you want to see what happens when sanctified violence goes horribly wrong, look at Judith's star work, particularly in The Golden Chain, where she dives into the messiness of the Fourth Crusade, specifically how that holy mandate can be used to justify atrocities. The Fourth Crusade was when the whole crusade got derailed and conquered Byzantium, a fellow Christian city, instead of going on to the Holy Land. On another side note, we'll be talking more about crusades later in the series as well. I won't focus too much on the Fourth here, as everybody knows about it, but if you do want an exploration of the Fourth Crusade, specifically how it could have gone differently, you should watch the channel Ultramere, where they do a great exploration of an alternate history of the Fourth Crusade. Okay, so how do we take these bloody bureaucratic origins and actually build a better fantasy world? When you're sitting down to design your own knightly orders, start with the money. Ask yourself these 3 questions. Who is signing the paychecks? If your knights aren't paid in gold, they're paid in power. Does your High King actually own the land, or has he franchised it out so much that his knights are more powerful than he is? If a knight loses their horse, are they out of a job? Or does the state provide a new tank, or do they need to make a new one from their own land? Remember, a knight without a fief is actually just a dangerous vagrant. Then, who pays the testosterone tax? If you have these elite warriors, where do they point their violence? Is there a piece of God to keep them from bullying the locals? Or do your knights have a holy war that they battle against? Then is your chivalry a hardware or a software? In your world, is knight a job description or a social class? Can a peasant like Dunk just find a suit of armor and claim the title, as in, can a knight make another knight? Or is knighthood more of a protector of the small situation, where the nobility has locked the doors and they keep the keys? You need to be noble to be a knight. In my opinion, it's more interesting when the code of honor is a weapon used by elites to keep outsiders out, but your mileage may vary. And now, while the awesome members of the channel scroll past, let me regale you with the sideways grandfather of the knights, the cataphracts. These were the elite heavy cavalry of powers like the Sarmatans, the Pantheons, and the Sassanans. Men and horses wrapped in layers of scale or laminar armor until they looked less like riders and more like moving fortresses. Their primary weapon was the kontos, a massive 2-handed lance often used in a full-on charge. Specialized saddles, disciplined formation, and sheer momentum let them hit with terrifying force despite the lack of stirrups. Which is why, despite the stirrup thesis, it's not all that in a bag of chips. The cataphracts' tactics weren't identical to later medieval cavalry tactics, but it was close enough to make the point. Heavy cavalry didn't suddenly appear in the Middle Ages. It had a long, deadly prehistory. The Romans learned this lesson the hard way, most famously at the Battle of Carrhae, where Parthian forces combining horse archers and armored cavalry dismantled a Roman army that was built to fight enemies who stood still and fought back on foot. But Rome being Rome, they did what they were famous for. They adapted. Especially in the later empire, Roman armies became more flexible and more cavalry heavy, incorporating their own version of armored horsemen, often called the clibanarii. While it's tempting to draw a straight line from the cataphracts to knights, history is once again more messier than that. The medieval knight wasn't copied from the East, so much as reinvented under different economic and political conditions. But the core idea, that of a heavily armored rider that could dominate the battlefield through speed and shock and staying power, that idea had already been proven centuries earlier, and it was simply made more by the invention of stirrup, lances, and high-cantled saddles. And that's exactly what we'll plunge into next time, the armor, equipment, and training of the knight. So make sure you're subscribed for that. If you made it this far, leave me a horse in the comments. And if you want to see more from me, check out my video on how to inherit a crown, and I will see you soon for another one.